Hello and welcome to this edition of Live and Ticking. Today we're asking, how much do you know about high blood pressure? I'm Fearghal McKinney, head of British Heart Foundation, Northern Ireland. High blood pressure, also known as hypertension, is a risk factor for many cardiovascular conditions, including heart attack, stroke, and vascular dementia. Although it's often symptomless, having high blood pressure can have a significant impact on our health. Today, we're going to hear from three speakers to help us understand more about this important risk factor and its impact on our bodies. We're delighted to be joined by Professor Brian Williams, who was appointed as our Chief Scientific and Medical Officer in the autumn last year. He's recognised as one of the UK's most influential clinical leaders and is a world-leading cardiovascular research expert in the field of high blood pressure. He's going to help us understand what hypertension is, the progress we've already made thanks to research, and what you can do to help lower your blood pressure. We'll also hear from Professor Maciej Tomaszewski, who is Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine at the University of Manchester. He's going to talk about his current research into understanding how high blood pressure is inherited through families and how gene activity in the kidney could make certain people prone to developing high blood pressure. But first, we'll be hearing from Joyce Agyare-Twum, who's part of the health content team here at the BHF. 15 years ago, Joyce was diagnosed with high blood pressure. After the initial shock of being diagnosed with this condition in her 30s, she decided to face things head on. From growing her own fruits and vegetables to adapting her traditional Ghanaian cooking, Joyce has taken every step to change her lifestyle and help reduce her risk. More from Joyce shortly. And if you have any questions for our speakers today, you can submit them via the Q&A box throughout the talks. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible during the session. However, if we're unable to answer your question, then you can call our heart helpline and speak directly to one of our cardiac nurses. You can also join our Health Unlocked community forum for support. This forum provides a safe space to discuss living with any heart or circulatory diseases. All of our incredible research is funded 100% by you, the public. If you're inspired by what you hear today, then any donations to support our life-saving work are very much welcomed and appreciated. There's a link to donate in the chat box should you wish to do so. Finally, before we hear from our speakers, I'd like to ask you a quick poll question. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how would you rate your understanding of high blood pressure? I'll just give you a second to register your vote. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker today. Joyce will be sharing her journey of being diagnosed with high blood pressure.
Hi, Joyce.
Hi, Joyce. And she'll be joined by Yana Theodoro to discuss her journey.
Thank you, Fearghal. Welcome, Joyce. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your story with us today. I think this is the first time we've had a BHF colleague join us to share their story. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. And I'm delighted to share my story with you.
Wonderful. So why don't you just introduce yourself to begin with? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, where you're from, your hobbies.
So my name is Joyce Agyare-Twum, and I originally come from Ghana in West Africa, one of the friendliest countries in the world. And I've lived in the UK for 19 years now. I have two children, Samuel, who is 23 years old, and Nana is 21 years old. And my background is finance and supply chain management. And I currently work in the BHF, as you mentioned, as a health information fulfillment manager. And I also work as, I'm the co-chair of the Black Affinity Group within the BHF. I love cooking and baking. In my spare time, I write poems and inspirational messages that I share with my friends and family. And I volunteer as a youth worker in my local church. And I also sing in the choir sometimes. And quite recently, I've developed a love for gardening. So briefly, that's me.
Lovely, lovely.
Yeah.
And why don't we turn to your experience with high blood pressure? So when did you first find out that you had high blood pressure, and how did you find that out?
So this was back in 2008. I had to visit a family health clinic, and the nurse took my blood pressure, and the first few readings she took, she said were quite high. So she asked me if I had high blood pressure, and I said, no, I didn't. And she said, I think you have high blood pressure because your blood pressure readings are quite high, so you should see your GP. At that point, I just didn't believe her because I was never ill or anything. And so I just thought there must be something wrong with her machine. So actually, I didn't take her advice. I just carried on with my life and then, didn't do anything about it. Then 2 months down the line, I had a planned procedure at my dentist. And my dentist told me for that procedure, before he did it, he had to take my blood pressure readings because he explained that sometimes the anesthetic they use interferes with the patient's high blood pressure. So I said, all right, then go ahead and do it. So he took the first few readings and he said, I think you have high blood pressure. Are you on medication? And I said, no, I'm not. I don't have high blood pressure and I'm not on any medication whatsoever. And he said, I'm sorry, but with these high readings, I won't be able to perform the procedure. You have to see your GP. At that point, reality kicked in. I could be having high blood pressure. I just broke down into tears because I didn't think somebody my age, should have high blood pressure. I always imagine people with high blood pressure to be quite old or elderly. And at that moment, I just thought, maybe I had to see my GP. So I went ahead to see my GP. And then over there, he took my blood pressure readings and he said, I think you have high blood pressure. And I think it was the bottom figure, that's diastolic, which was quite high. So he said he would put me on medication. So he did that. And then he also said I needed to do some blood tests to check if I had any raised cholesterol. He did that. And unfortunately came back that I had high blood pressure. Sorry, a raised cholesterol in addition to the high blood pressure. So he advised me. He didn't put me on medication at the time, but he said with some lifestyle changes and with the medication for the blood pressure, I would be able to reduce my blood pressure and also reduce the cholesterol level. So that's how come I was diagnosed with blood pressure.
Yeah. And how did it feel to get that diagnosis? Because I know your dad also had high blood pressure. You sort of saw how the lifestyle changes he had to make. How did it feel to know that you were also diagnosed?
So at that point, I was in shock. And as I said, I didn't think somebody as young as me could have high blood pressure. And I also felt a sense of shame because I felt I probably hadn't taken care of myself. That was why I had high blood pressure. So at that, just also thinking about my father, he had to take a lot of medication at the time. My mother had to cook his food separately. He went on to have 2 strokes anyway. And for my mother to help him manage his condition, she took him off salt completely. So all that was playing on my mind. I was going to be on medication for the rest of my life. I wasn't going to live a normal life anymore. And I wasn't going to enjoy the foods I love most because I don't have a sweet tooth. I love savory food. And of course, you use salt to kind of add some taste and flavor to your savory food. So I thought I was going to be miserable. And my children were young. I think they were 8 and 6 at the time. I was just a miserable wreck at the time. And then I said to myself, if I had to live, a healthy life and not be that miserable, then I had to follow through with the instructions my GP gave me to, improve my lifestyle. So,
and what lifestyle changes did you make? With your food
what he told me was I could cut back on my salt intake for my blood pressure to reduce. And I also had to be active. With the activeness, he said to me, Joyce, you don't need to do any strenuous exercise. Just brisk walking 30 minutes a day can help reduce your blood pressure or improve your lifestyle. And then he said, I also had to make some changes to the way I prepared my food. And I agreed, because obviously from reading the leaflet he gave me a leaflet when I visited him. I found out that my Ghanaian diet, culturally, we ate a lot of salt because we used a lot of salted fish. So I decided to cut back on my salt intake, by reducing the amount of salted fish I ate. So I just added a tiny bit to flavor the food. And then I also, to kind of make up for the salt, reduce salt, I added spices. Sometimes I'll make my own spice mix to make it, tasty. I started walking briskly. I did a step count. I signed up to a 10,000 steps a day challenge. I did that. I bought an exercise bike at home just to keep, active and healthy. And we also use a lot of, traditionally in my country, we use a lot of palm oil, which has a lot of saturated fat. So I decided to use very little of it to cook. And I also changed the way I cooked. I stopped deep frying my food. I was grilling my meat, taking the skin off the chicken. And yeah, and also eating a lot more vegetables and fruits and vegetables. I cut back on my
growing your. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so then later on down the line, I started growing my own vegetables and fruits. So I knew that spinach, for instance, contain a lot of potassium. So I grew a lot of spinach, I think tomatoes, and yeah, runner beans. I just went crazy with the fruits and vegetables. Strawberries, just to make sure I added a lot more fruits and vegetables rather than carb, because a lot of our food is carb heavy, carb based. So those were some of the changes I made. And gradually, when I went back, my GP requested for a blood test again, and my cholesterol level had gone down. And yeah, he put me on medication for my blood pressure, and it had come to normal. It was within the normal range. So I realized what I was doing was working. So I decided to keep doing it, and also encourage my family, which was my husband and children, to do it. But because at that time I was so ashamed of my condition that I didn't tell anybody. I just kept it within my immediate family. Yeah. So those were some of the changes I made. Yeah.
Yeah. And how did your children feel about the sort of changing of food in the household? Did you cook separately for them, or did you cook all together?
No, I didn't. I didn't, because the doctor told me I didn't have to go cold turkey with the salt. So I just had to reduce the salt. And my children actually were all right with it. Of course, at that time they were quite young, so they ate everything I cooked for them. I think the only thing they missed sometimes was fried chicken with the skin on. So sometimes they would tell me, Mommy, can we have fried chicken with the skin on? And I said, well, why not? I said, treat, I'll make it for them, because I knew that they were young and they would easily burn off the calories by, running around and all that. So I gladly did that for them when they asked for it. But then I think those changes I made kind of impacted their lives. So when they got much older and they went to university, they started cooking healthily. My daughter especially, she started cooking healthy meals. And then when she came home, she would make all these healthy meals from around the world. She would try food from, Greece, France, everywhere. And then she would share the recipes with me and I would cook it. And then sometimes, we kept each other in check about what we ate, how much we ate, the quantity we ate, and then the amount of salt we put in the food. So yeah, my family was supportive. Yeah.
That's great. That's great for them, because obviously you've seen your dad go through it, and we know that high blood pressure runs in families. So bedding in those good habits with them from a young age is great. And finally, what advice would you give to somebody who might have been diagnosed or told that they've got high blood pressure, and yeah, what words of wisdom would you tell them?
So I would tell them, well, if you are an African like me, because when I joined the BHF, I found out that people from Black, African and Caribbean background suffered a lot from high blood pressure. So then for my friends who had high blood pressure at the time, I was able to tell them to reduce their salt intake, to also try to stay active, and with their medication to not stop taking it, because some of them, when I told them about my condition and how I had made changes and all that, they came out to tell me, yes, I also had high blood pressure and all that. So I told them, but then some of them had stopped taking the medication when they felt they had gotten better. So I said to them, don't stop taking it, because you never know when your blood pressure is going up. Just keep taking it until your doctor tells you not to do it. So cut back on your salt intake, be active, move at all costs, just move your body, and then keep taking your medication. I think those are the three main things I would tell anybody who's recently been diagnosed to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joyce. Thanks for sharing that with us today. And Fearghal, back over to you.
Yes, Joyce, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Our next speaker is Professor Brian Williams, who's going to share some of his expert knowledge in this area. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you very much, and looking forward to just giving you a brief update on blood pressure and some of the issues that need to be thought about in patients with high blood pressure. So what is blood pressure? Why do we have it? Well, basically, we have to move blood around the body through the blood vessels, and the heart is a pump, and the heart generates a pressure, and that pressure pushes the blood around the circulation, and that's fundamental to life. And when it pumps, there's a peak pressure, and we call that the systolic pressure, as you'll see in a moment. And then when the heart is relaxing between beats, the pressure drops to a resting pressure, which is the diastolic pressure. And they're the two pressures that we're interested in. And we're interested in this because obviously, as the heart pumps, the vessels, the blood vessels are exposed to this pressure. And if that pressure is too high, it can cause damage to the blood vessels, not immediately, unless it's extremely high, but really over a long period of time, chronically being exposed to an elevated pressure over a long period of time. So that's when you see these two numbers. The systolic is the peak pressure every heartbeat, and the diastolic is the resting pressure between heartbeats. And both of them are relevant because both of them contribute to the pressure load on the blood vessels and also the pressure load on the heart. Now, for Joyce, nothing to be ashamed of, Joyce. Bottom line is high blood pressure is incredibly common, really, really common. And I often say to my patients, you've either got it or you're probably going to get it in your lifetime. And the reason for that is that the risk of developing high blood pressure increases with age. And actually 1 in 3 people who are adults in the United Kingdom have high blood pressure. Not all of them know about it, but 1 in 3 of them have it. So it's not a very exclusive club. And as you get older, so for example, over the age of 60 years, we're approaching 50%. That's half the people over the age of 60 will have high blood pressure. And then if you live to a ripe old age and a full life expectancy to the mid-80s, there's approximately a 90% chance. In other words, there's only a 1 in 10 chance that you won't have high blood pressure by that stage of your life. So this is really common, and it's associated with aging, and to some extent it's difficult to avoid, particularly living in a modern Western society. Now, the reason why this is such an important topic is that if you look at the risk factors for premature death, and this is global data, this is looking around the whole world, then the #1 risk factor for premature death in 2016, so that's the last time this big analysis was done, was high blood pressure. And that's overtaken things like malnutrition and infection it really is one of the major problems in the world, largely because it's undetected and it's untreated. But what's really depressing is the projection is that if you go forward to 2040, that hypertension, high blood pressure will still be the number one in terms of its contribution to premature death around the world. So basically, this is an important issue to detect and an important issue to treat. And the reason why blood pressure can be so dangerous is, of course, that when you look at the circulatory system, pretty much all major systems in the body obviously require a circulation. And therefore, if the pressure's increased in the circulation, that pressure's transmitted to organs like the brain and increases the risk of stroke. Can actually also increase the risk of vision loss later in life due to macular degeneration, which you may have heard about. It can increase the pressure on the kidneys and cause them to start having less function later in life. And of course, it can contribute to sexual dysfunction because of the importance of blood vessels there as well. But in terms of the heart, that's where a lot of the impact comes, and it increases the risk of heart failure and increases the risk of heart attack, the latter being due to the damage to the main arteries of the heart. Now, one of the reasons why the heart is so vulnerable is the heart is the pump. And that is the thing that's trying to pump this blood around the body, and it's now pumping against a high pressure. And if you pump against a high pressure, then the wall of the heart gets thicker and thicker. It's the same as going to the gym and lifting weights. Your muscles will get bigger in the same way your heart muscles get bigger because they're having to work harder to push the blood around the body. And when the heart becomes hypertrophied like that, then this increases the risk later in life of developing heart failure. It increases the risk that the heart muscle will become irritable and you will develop arrhythmias. These are abnormal heart rhythms. And it increases the risk of developing angina because that muscle needs more blood flow. And therefore, you can sometimes get chest pain because there's not enough blood flow to the bigger muscle. So, there's a particularly strong effect of blood pressure on the heart. But the good news is, now that might all sound quite depressing, but the good news is that the treatment of high blood pressure is one of the best studied areas in medicine. There have been more trials on the treatment of high blood pressure than anything else. There have been more patients in trials of the treatment of high blood pressure on anything else. And when NICE evaluated this, when I was chairing one of their committees, they regarded it as the most cost-effective treatment there is in healthcare. So this is really good news. And this bubble diagram over here really summarizes the data from very large numbers of clinical trials. And what it shows is as you lower your blood pressure, your risk of a major cardiovascular event such as heart disease or stroke decreases as the blood pressure comes down. So the high blood pressure increases risk, but as you bring it down, that risk gets reversed. And the extraordinary thing is that just lowering the top or the bottom number by 20 millimeters of mercury, which isn't a lot. Remember, it's already 140 or above. You've got to get it down to 130 or below. Doing that halves the risk of having a heart disease and stroke. And so this is really powerful data in millions of people showing that our treatments are very effective. But as Joyce commented on, and I must say, Joyce, you're slightly unusual because most of my patients don't take any notice when I tell them to change their lifestyle. But you've done a remarkable job. But basically, there are things you can do to help yourself. Firstly, to stop yourself getting a high blood pressure or reducing the risk until later in life, if you've got a family history, because family history is quite strong predictor. Or if you're on treatment even with medication, these lifestyle measures are still important. And the things that are important are, firstly, not drinking too much alcohol. You don't have to stop drinking alcohol at all if you like alcohol, but don't drink too much, and binge drinking is not good because it makes your blood pressure drive up. Obviously, stopping smoking, not so much of an effect on blood pressure, but actually important in reducing the risk of heart disease, which is magnified by high blood pressure. Inevitably, being overweight increases your blood pressure. Not doing enough exercise increases your blood pressure. And eating too much salt in the diet increases your blood pressure. So what you can do is try and reduce your salt intake. Certainly don't add salt to food. Try something else, like Joyce said, spices. Moderate the amount of alcohol. Try and take a bit more exercise. You don't have to go out and buy a load of Lycra or join an expensive gym. As Joyce said, walking regularly on a regular basis is really good, and try and maintain an ideal control of your body weight. And that will reduce your blood pressure, may also reduce the number of medications that you need. But most people with high blood pressure need medication. And that is important, because to get the blood pressure down, it's not just lowering it a little bit. It's really taking it down to a new level, which is closer to normal, to try and reduce the risk to an optimal level. And to achieve that, then most people need to take at least 2 different medications together to get their blood pressure optimally controlled. Indeed, when I was chairman of the European guidelines for hypertension, we recommended that pretty much everybody should start treatment with 2 medications at the same time, and stay on at least 2 medications to maintain smooth and effective blood pressure control if their blood pressure hasn't come down enough with lifestyle measurements alone. And the other thing that doctors never mention to their patients is that the treatment is usually for life. And the reason for that is that your blood pressure tends to go up as you get older. So actually, it should get even more difficult to control as you get older. But if you start treatment early and you keep it controlled for a long time, that really helps. So it's treatment for life. It's not like antibiotics. It doesn't go away like an infection. You need to keep your blood pressure down for life. But as I've said, the really good news, with a lot of evidence behind it, is that treating blood pressure reduces the risk of heart disease, reduces the risk of stroke, reduces the risk of dementia, actually, kidney disease, and of course, reduces your risk of dying early, which is particularly important. And this slide looks a bit complicated. It actually refers to the guideline which I chaired 4 years ago. But I just wanted to put this up to emphasize 3 points that are now really top of the agenda for doctors. Firstly, get blood pressure lower. And we make the diagnosis when one of these numbers is above 140 or 90. And our aim initially is to get your blood pressure below 140/90 on a consistent basis on treatment. And if possible, actually try and get it on a consistent basis below 130/80, because that's where you get the optimal benefit. Secondly, we're trying to urge people and doctors not to be too complacent about this. We used to take a long time to up-titrate treatment and get people controlled. We now, when we decide to start medication, really want to try and get people controlled within a few months, and ideally within 3 months. And then over time, stay on the medication and maintain a consistent, good quality level of control. And that is the best way of protecting yourself for the future. But one of the problems I just wanted to finish with is that despite all the evidence, despite all the knowledge that this is one of the most important risk factors for death, probably half the people, even in our country, don't know they have high blood pressure. And of the people who are on treatment, 4 out of 10 people are not treated to even less than 140/90 target, the first target. And to some extent, that's because patients are sometimes resistant to take 2 medications and rather stay on 1, when we know that 2 medications is needed for most people. But also, unfortunately, I don't think patients get enough information from my colleagues about the need to stay on treatment and why it's so important. And therefore, people tend to drift off the treatment over time, particularly as blood pressure doesn't cause side effects. So people don't necessarily feel better on treatment. They just don't notice any difference. But actually it is protecting you. And that's quite a difficult message to get across to patients. And we've now become much more aware that we need to talk to patients about the importance of staying on medication. So I'll finish with this slide and say, well, despite the fact that blood pressure has been one of the most studied areas of medicine, it's one of the areas where we have some of the best data about the effectiveness and quality of treatment. At the BHF, we continue to make significant investments in a whole range of clinical trials to try and better understand what we should do further to continue to improve the treatment, developing new drug treatments, looking at new ways of looking at the effects of treatments on the heart and the brain to make sure things are improving, looking at whether we should actually be lowering blood pressure to even lower targets, and also doing a lot of biological work and genetic work trying to understand why people get blood pressure elevation in the first place and whether there's anything we could be doing about it that we're not doing at the moment. If you're interested in that, there'll be a link in the chat to all of the research that goes on, funded by the British Heart Foundation, which means it's funded by you, the public, because we are totally dependent on public donations and support to enable us to do this good work. Anyway, I hope that's been a useful summary of high blood pressure from a clinical perspective, and also complementary to the excellent discussion that we had earlier with Joyce. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Brian. Very informative indeed. Our final speaker today is Professor Maciej Tomaszewski, who's going to tell us a bit about the research he's currently doing into the genetics of high blood pressure. Over to you, Maciej.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Fearghal, and huge thanks to British Heart Foundation for inviting me to talk about hypertension. I will talk about my research on understanding of genetic background of hypertension, but I'm also a practicing clinician. I am responsible for management of hypertension here in the Manchester Hypertension Service. So I'm sure that a lot of people who have joined us today on this call realize that high blood pressure or hypertension, as Brian explained, runs in families. And it's not uncommon to see the history of high blood pressure in our patients' parents and their parents. It is a risk factor of hypertension to have your parents already affected. And that's the reason why we ask this question in our hypertension clinics. I'm sure many of you who have been diagnosed with hypertension have been asked about this. What is the actual evidence that blood pressure and genetics have something to do with common? I think the best, perhaps, illustration of how powerful genetics is in shaping up our blood pressure and our pathway to the development of hypertension comes from the analysis of twins. And this research conducted by Professor Fred Luft in Berlin many years ago showed very explicitly that the stronger the genetic similarity, the stronger similarity in blood pressure, so that identical twins who share 100% of their genetic information have almost 80% similarity when it comes to their blood pressure measured in the clinic. So how does this genetic information travel from one generation to another, increasing the risk of hypertension in some individuals? Well, it is a part of our genetic material called DNA, and it is packed in one, or we don't know exactly how many yet, in one or more of 20,000 human genes. So this is what we have inherited in our parents. There's over 20,000 genes in our DNA, and our job in Manchester and beyond is to decipher which of those 20,000 genes are responsible for the development of high blood pressure or hypertension. I should mention that genetics of hypertension is a little bit more complex than that, because everyone is different when it comes to the quality or quantity of genetic information that determines the risk of hypertension. In very, very rare cases, extremely rare cases, there's only one genetic abnormality responsible for the entire blood pressure elevation. This is usually very severe high blood pressure. We call it monogenic hypertension, but it happens extremely rarely. And you see it on the bottom panel here under A, where in the blue background, there is one powerful genetic abnormality that determines the entire blood pressure elevation. In most of us, in almost all of our patients, the situation is slightly different. For a common hypertension or garden variety of hypertension, if you like, there you see a lot of many genetic variants working together to bring blood pressure up, together with the environmental factors. So I want to talk a little bit now about what we do to find the genes of human hypertension. And we follow up on very powerful multi-center experiments called Genomewide association studies. So those studies conducted over the last decade or even earlier all around the world brought together hundreds of patients with high blood pressure and people with normal blood pressure as normal controls, and analyzed the entire genetic material, the entire DNA, to find regions or signatures, as I call it, around the human genome where those potential genes of high blood pressure may sit. And on your right, you will see here is our human DNA divided in 22 chromosomes. I don't show sex chromosomes because it's a slightly separate story, but you can see every dot illustrates at least one signature. So we have almost 1,000 points in our DNA whereby there might be a gene that determines high blood pressure. So what we do in Manchester is we work with our nephrologists, computational biologists, statisticians, bioinformaticians, artificial intelligence people, and many other specialties to uncover genes of hypertension through analysis of human tissue. And we selected the kidney as our model. That's the tissue we study in order to find the genes of hypertension. Why did we select the kidney for our studies, one may ask? Well, because we believe it is one of the most important, if not the most important, tissue that determines blood pressure in the human body. And there are a few pieces of information in favor of this, of our belief in the kidney here. Well, firstly, we know it produces renin, a very powerful molecule that regulates blood pressure in the human body. Perhaps most persuasively, all rare conditions that I've mentioned on the first slides, whereby one genetic abnormality is responsible for high blood pressure, work through the kidney. They all work through the genes expressed in the kidney. And some of you and many of our patients will be on drugs called diuretics, and those drugs that lower blood pressure, they work specifically through the kidney. So I think there's a lot of evidence to demonstrate that kidney is the key tissue responsible for high blood pressure and that's why we study it in our research in Manchester. So in a nutshell, we collect kidney tissue after surgeries, usually where kidney is removed because of the cancer. But of course, we are not interested in the part of the kidney affected by the cancer. We are interested in the part of the kidney where there is a little bit of healthy tissue. We sample the organ, and we then secure our samples for further sophisticated genetic and other experiments. And we are very lucky to have, or very fortunate to have created possibly the largest repository of human kidney tissue for the purpose of genetic analysis in the world. We have it here in Manchester, and we have now about 900 kidneys, which is quite a powerful resource for our analysis. And here are a few, and having such a magnificent resource, you can do all kinds of experiments in the lab and on the screen of our computers in search of the genes of human hypertension. And one of the most powerful dimensions of this resource is that apart from the kidney samples, we have all other information collected. We have information of blood biochemistry, urine analysis, clinical information, and when you bring it all together, it is really a very powerful resource to study the genetics of hypertension. And here is a snapshot from our recent paper published in Nature Communications 2 months ago. We uncovered the identity of 399 kidney genes that are causally linked to high blood pressure, in other words, drivers of human hypertension. And I'm very grateful to Professor Williams and British Heart Foundation for not only funding this research, but also for gracing the press release that we have made on our study publicly. This is hugely appreciated by us here in Manchester. But what is the message from this analysis, apart from identifying the 399 kidney genes that drive blood pressure? Well, firstly, we have helped those researchers that have completed the large genetic scans of the human genome and identified the signatures. Now we know which specific genes are responsible for those signals of association with blood pressure. Many of those genes are very druggable. That means that those genes can be targets for the development of future blood pressure lowering medications. Some of those genes have a very high level of similarity when it comes to their abundance between the kidney and cells found in urine. And this is an important diagnostic opportunity because we can't take kidney samples from everyone, but we could certainly secure non-invasively urine samples for this purpose. But I think the most exciting avenue for future research lies in our ability to predict the activity or abundance of these genes in the kidney in individual people without a need of a biopsy, by using genetic information only. That means that we could be in a position to select patients for appropriate drugs just based on their genetic information in the future. And we would like to study how this genetically predicted expression of kidney genes can help in this undertaking. We also very much hope that it will lead to safer treatment and precise selection, that is precise selection of doses of specific medications that work through the kidney based on the information on the kidney genes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Majid, very much indeed. Now we're going to welcome back both Brian and Joyce to be joined, of course, by Majid for the question and answer portion of the event. You have been submitting questions, and this is your opportunity to drive the conversation, if you like. And I'll be asking the questions based on those most upvoted. So perhaps one for you, Brian. Why does blood pressure fluctuate so much, and is this unusual?
Well, because the demands from the various organs of the body fluctuate quite a bit, and the heart is signaled to either increase or reduce outflow. And if it increases it, it puts more pressure into the system. When you're younger, that tends to be smoothed by more elastic arteries. As you get older, changes in cardiac output in response to increased demand tend to be less well smoothed. So you get more spikes and variability in blood pressure, which is exactly what we see as people get older. And that's one of the reasons why the top number, the systolic blood pressure, goes up with age, because the arteries get stiffer. So the heart's having to pump against a much stiffer system, and therefore the top pressure rises. And that's why in some people, the only thing you see elevated is the top pressure. You still need to treat that, though.
Okay. One for you, Joyce. Do you have any, what was the hardest lifestyle change for you?
For me, it was the salt. I just couldn't go off the salt completely. Like I said, I love savory foods, and going off salt completely was my nightmare. But then when I got told that I could reduce it and then make some substitutes, that was kind of, I was able to adapt to that, and it actually helped me enjoy my meals better. Yeah, so I think that it was the main thing. The rest, I don't think, were difficult because I could walk. You know, I didn't need to do any strenuous activities, even though I went to the gym. And then, yeah, growing my fruits and vegetables, I could eat more fruits and vegetables. It was mainly the salt that was a problem for me, but then I got around to it. Yeah.
Okay. I did say that you can drive the conversation. I didn't mean it in this way, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Joyce, have you any tips for growing your own fruit and veg? I can't seem to get anything to grow in a few seconds.
Well, okay. If you got space, then of course you can grow fruits and vegetables that you can eat. You don't need to you don't need, it's not rocket science. You can get, small pots, yeah, and then start small. Just grow vegetables that you can eat. I love spinach, so I grow spinach and tomatoes. And you don't need a vast amount of land like us. You can buy grow bags. I buy grow bags from Amazon. They're quite cheap to buy. Buy some, soil from your local shop, and then you can start with any food you like to eat. Yes. And then it'll be easier. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks you. One for you, Majid. I'm an Asian 39-year-old. Both parents suffer from high blood pressure. What can I do to prevent getting high blood pressure?
Right. So the first step has already been done. Being aware of history of hypertension puts you in an excellent position to initiate some prevention early, because you are at higher risk of developing than the others. That doesn't mean that you will. However, in order to be on the safer side, I assume you are not yet hypertensive. The most sensible strategy is to initiate what we call primary prevention. That is, in essence, initiating a lot of those lifestyle changes that Joyce discussed when she was diagnosed. Indeed, there is a huge overlap between what we call primary prevention and prophylaxis of preventing hypertension and lifestyle changes in already established hypertension. So in essence, reduce your salt intake, exercise regularly, watch healthy weight, and avoid drinking alcohol in excess. These are the most effective ones. There are other ones, but that's the first step to preventing hypertension. Of course, keeping an eye on the blood pressure is important, because despite all these changes, you might still develop it in the future. So checking your blood pressure on a regular basis is a part of the healthy surveillance that I would recommend.
Right, and this is specifically for you, and some of that may have been answered just now, but where are we? Just bear with me 2 seconds. It all jumped off the screen. I take high medication for blood pressure. Can lifestyle changes lead to me not having to take this forever?
So it depends. And so firstly, lifestyle changes, if you haven't done them before, you started treatment with medication and now you start doing them, that might further reduce your blood pressure. And if it does, and it takes it down to a very low level, then it's possible that you could back titrate some of the treatment or reduce the dose if that's the case. But we would not normally, there's one scenario where we wouldn't normally come off treatment, and that is in somebody who's either already had a cardiovascular event, like a stroke or a mini stroke or a heart attack, or it's got some evidence of vascular disease. We'd be very reluctant to take somebody off medication because of the risk of deteriorating blood pressure in that individual. So yes, lifestyle interventions can help further reduce your blood pressure. In my experience, what it usually does in people on treatment, it just makes their control even better. It doesn't usually result in me back titrating treatment. I mean, the reality is most people on treatment now should be on pretty well tolerated medications. The modern treatments that we recommend and we use on a regular basis don't really cause much in the way of side effects if they're used well. There are some with occasional ones, but generally they're very well tolerated compared to what they were 30 or 40 years ago.
This question is from Subia. Is there such a thing as nervous hypertension, and could it lead on to a high blood pressure condition?
Well, your blood pressure will go up if you're anxious. And one of the challenges, even with measuring blood pressure, is some people, when you measure the blood pressure in the doctor's office, it's very high. It drives me mad when I'm working in an emergency department, when people ring me up and say, we've got a man down here, his blood pressure is very high. I said, I'm not surprised, he's broke his leg. So, I mean, so it's not, basically we try to measure blood pressure in a standardized condition. But if sometimes it's high in the doctors and you measure it yourself at home, and as long as you're measuring it properly with a validated monitor at home, if it's normal at home, then we trust the home readings. That's not that we don't trust the doctor, it's just the environment in some people can make the blood pressure a little bit higher than it really is most of the time. So anxiety and stress can definitely raise blood pressure.
Emily Worcester wants to know, what do you think governments from across the UK and the NHS need to do to tackle high blood pressure?
Well, I mean, I think this is a really good question because everybody's living longer. People want to be healthy in their later life, and we want to take the burden off the healthcare system for the consequences of high blood pressure. So I think it would be incredibly good investment from any government anywhere to pay more attention to making sure that everybody knows what their blood pressure is, making available facilities in public places so blood pressure can be measured easily. At the British Heart Foundation, actually, we have now campaigns, which you'll be aware of, Joyce and Fearghal, we're going into big companies and getting these companies to start screening their workforce to make sure they're healthy and that their blood pressures are being detected. So screening programs are incredibly important. And if you look at things like health check, they're all well-intentioned, but I just don't think many people are taking them up, or indeed are finding it difficult to make appointments to get things measured. So, I think trying to put more investment into prevention, better detection, better facilities for treatment. And I think in the future, with people being able to measure their blood pressure at home more effectively with devices now, people being able to download information, it's quite probable that a lot of this chronic management of things like blood pressure will move into the community, away from needing to see doctors on such a regular basis, because much of this can be done very straightforwardly.
Okay. For Joyce, a comment and a question. Feeling ashamed of conditions like these seems to be such a common thing when I speak to people, is this question of which they shouldn't, of course, they're saying. But do you feel differently now?
Yes, I I'm no longer ashamed, like I said, especially when I found out by working at the BHF that people from my community, that's the African and Caribbean community, have a higher risk. Then I felt kind of empowered with that knowledge to go out there, tell people in my community, in my family. I wasn't able to tell my mother at first because I didn't want her to be worried for me and also to think, oh, I had been irresponsible. But then having that information and also knowing that even though I was in my 30s, I could still have high blood pressure. I was able to go out, so I don't feel ashamed anymore. I'm able to tell people. And recently I've been involved in encouraging people to have their blood pressure tested at their local pharmacy. So I'm no longer ashamed.
Very good.
Yeah.
Majid, what's the effect of low blood pressure as a comparable to hypertension?
So low blood pressure also has some risks, but generally we are less worried about low blood pressure than high blood pressure. Actually, it is quite safe to have low blood pressure below 110 and 70. It's where we see the highest level of cardiovascular benefit. Of course, it becomes a problem when patients develop symptoms. And we often see that in patients who might be taking too much medications, for example. And that's when the most common symptoms that patients report to us at this stage would be dizziness on standing up or bending. It's called postural hypertension, and we routinely check for that in patients. This is obviously easier to manage because what we do is reduce the number of medications or reduce the number of the doses and find the balance between the blood pressure that we think it's safe and the well-being of the patients. And I think this is a very common matter we deal in our hypertension services.
And I would add, Fearghal, that one of the problems with the definition of low blood pressure is, of course, what is low. And it's interesting, if you go to parts of the world that are basically unaffected by Western lifestyles, where they eat very basic, healthy diets, you find blood pressures of 90 systolic. And that is probably the normal human blood pressure. We never see that very much in the West, because all of our blood pressures have been elevated by the environment and the lifestyles that we basically can't escape from. So I think we need to accept that a normal blood pressure is probably below 100 systolic in true normality, but we very rarely ever see that. And actually, we certainly don't try and achieve it with treatment, because as Maggie says, if you've been exposed to a very high blood pressure for a very long time, we have to be realistic about how fast and how low we can take it. And that's why we say getting it below 140 is our start. But what we ideally want to see is it below 130 on a consistent basis. So a blood pressure in the 120s and in the 70s, not above 80, is the kind of levels we like to see on treatment now.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you all very much for both speaking and answering the questions. Thank you at home for all your questions. We haven't managed to get to all of them, but if there's any specific issues, then email in to BHF, where you can perhaps get specific answers to some of those that you've asked. Thank you for watching this edition of Live and Ticking. We hope you've enjoyed hearing from all of our brilliant speakers. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask you the final poll question. How would you rate your understanding now of high blood pressure? And once again, that's on a range of between 1 and 5. And I'll let you take just a moment to register your vote.
That's good.
This is all made possible by you from your generous contributions and support. If you'd like to make a donation towards our life-saving research, there's a link in the chat box. But once again, thank you all very much for watching today, and we look forward to informing you of our next Live and Ticking next month. Thank you.